Hello everybody, and welcome back to Mystery Disappearance. If you've watched any of my previous 8 episodes on the disappearance of Joshua Guimond, you probably noticed that I brought up Chris Jenkins' name a few times. Chris Jenkins had disappeared on Halloween night 2002, a little over a week before Josh disappeared. I thought it would only be appropriate that we take a closer look at the case of Chris Jenkins, which is a very mysterious case all on its own, and remains unsolved to this day. Even though Josh Guimond and Chris Jenkins had never met in their real lives, their disappearances within a close time frame would forever link their names and mysteries together. In this episode, we'll take a look at how Josh and Chris's names became connected by fate. So, Christopher Mark Jenkins grew up in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. He was the jovial and happy son of Steve and Jan Jenkins, and younger brother of Sarah. In fall 2002, he was a senior honor business student at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. He was 21 years old by this time. He was also co-captain of the lacrosse team as well as its goalie, and seemingly got along well with anybody with his happy-go-lucky attitude. Tragically, on Thursday, Halloween, October 31st, 2002, it would be the last time that friends and family would see Chris or hear from him. This Halloween evening started as normal as any college student's Halloween evening could. At 6 p.m., Chris and some friends were partying at home. Between 10:30 p.m. and 11 p.m., Chris, his girlfriend at the time, Ashley Rice, and another couple, mutual friends, went to the Lone Tree Bar and Grill, located at 528 Hennepin Avenue, on the corner of 6th Street North. This bar no longer exists today. Their car was parked a bit south of this bar. Chris was dressed in a brown nylon Native American costume, shirt and pants, with a matching headband and a red feather. Part of his costume were slip-on shoes. Since Chris didn't have any pockets, his girlfriend held on to his phone, his wallet, and his jacket. However, around 12:30 a.m., Chris was seemingly forced out of the bar. The bouncer recalled Chris taking a left on Hennepin Avenue. Chris Jenkins was never seen alive again. On Friday, November 1st, Chris's father, Steve, tried to call Chris, but got his roommate named Ben Kroon instead. The roommate reveals Chris is missing and hasn't been seen since the night before. Friends were looking for him, and Chris's Halloween costume wasn't in his room, meaning that he never made it home. Chris's mom, Jan Jenkins, later that day called Ashley Rice, the girl Chris was dating. Upset, Jan asked why Chris was left on his own. Ashley Rice hung up the phone. Wow, she really seemed concerned. From what I can gather, Chris and Ashley were seeing each other, but nothing seemed too serious yet, although the Jenkins family had met her the weekend before. However, with Chris's disappearance, she displayed a surprising lack of concern. By 5:30 p.m., Christian Bailey and Ben Sims, friends of Chris's as well as his co-captains for the lacrosse team, arrived to help with the search. Christian recalls seeing Ashley Rice sitting on the sofa casually chatting with her friends. She then went to Chris's room to get a few things, seemingly unfazed by his disappearance, or maybe not taking it seriously. It's worth mentioning that Ashley Rice was an employee at the Lone Tree Bar and worked that day, but was not working the evening before when she went there with Chris and friends. By 10 p.m., Steve Jenkins called the Minneapolis Police Department, MPD, to report his son missing. After some runaround, the MPD tells the Jenkins that because Chris is over 18 years of age, they will not start the investigation until he's been missing for at least 72 hours. This shocked and angered the Jenkins, since they lived 350 miles away and couldn't look for their son. The Jenkins tried to force the report 2 more times, and it was only first taken seriously on November 5th. By November 2nd, the Jenkins were driving to Minneapolis and picked up their daughter Sarah at an airport along the way. During this drive, the family came up with a few ideas. 1. Hire a private investigator, and 2. Get media involved as much as possible. When the Jenkins arrived in Minneapolis, they were joined by many people for the search. Friends, family, professors, students, members of the lacrosse team, strangers, hundreds of people, even psychics called in. Sadly, the searches yielded no results. On Wednesday, November 6, Michael Knoll, 22 years old, disappears from a bar in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Circumstances were similar to Chris Jenkins. Michael Knoll walked out of a bar, intoxicated, last seen near water when disappeared. Upon hearing this, theories surfaced as to whether there might be a serial killer targeting young men along the Mississippi River. The Jenkins family hired private investigator Chuck Letch, who had been a successful PI since 1978, having over 3 decades of experience. On Saturday, November 2nd, Chuck Lech and Don Enger questioned people at the Lone Tree Bar who had worked on Halloween night. They quickly collected useful information for the Jenkins family. One bouncer working outside stated that he was in fact contacted not to let the young man dressed in an Indian costume back in the bar. A girl who was covering for Ashley Rice's shift saw Chris being escorted out of the bar. A few people believe Chris wasn't able to re-enter the bar because he didn't have his ID with him. Remember, his friends, probably Ashley, was carrying his wallet and keys. Some people speculated that Chris may have left on his own. However, Lech and Enger haven't heard one account of Chris being rowdy or having any type of altercation with anybody. Nobody stated that he was causing trouble or anything. He wouldn't have just left his date either. So it begs the question, why was he escorted out? One person stated that Chris was talking to an MPD officer by the name of Mike Casey. Once Chris walked away, Officer Casey talked with the security supervisor of the bar, and soon after, Chris was forced to leave. Lech and Enger relayed this information to the Jenkins family on Sunday, November 3rd. They planned to return to the bar for more questioning. The bar was closed on Sunday and Monday, but by the time they returned on Tuesday, a gag order had been issued by the bar. Employees were no longer allowed to talk to the investigators about Halloween evening without a lawyer present, and were even threatened to get fired if they talk. So, obviously, the bar was taking steps to cover its own ass. In reality, a bar has every right to eject a customer they deem troublesome or too intoxicated, but a bit of common sense should have been used here. Chris wasn't appropriately dressed for the cold weather, being without his jacket. He didn't have his wallet or personal belongings on him. It is my feeling that all this happened quickly, and Chris's friends didn't know he was being escorted. If this happened because of a conversation he's had with Officer Mike Casey, you got to wonder what they talked about. The Jenkins family couldn't get much help from local law enforcement. They seemed to encounter shameless resistance from them at every step, receiving very little help. As Chuck Lech and Don Enger continued their investigation, they learned various things, like Ashley Rice being flirtatious with Officer Mike Casey that evening. As a Halloween costume, she was wearing police clothes apparently borrowed from him, along with his badge and patch. It makes you wonder if Chris Jenkins didn't like this flirtatious behavior and had a bit of a jealous fit to Officer Casey, which ultimately resulted in Chris being escorted out. Ashley Rice had a meeting with co-workers later that night around 1:30 a.m. and was then driven home by Officer Casey. Officer Casey was a married man with children, but we don't know if this was just harmless flirting or if more was going on, but it's a possibility of the turn of events that led Chris Jenkins to be pushed outside alone without his belongings. Lech and Enger learned some other things, like somebody getting brutally beaten by gang members that night in front of Times Square's Pizza, across the street and half a block down from the Lone Tree Bar. But the time and whether it was Chris or not has never been confirmed. Bloodhounds were used as well, at least 2 different bloodhounds on 2 different occasions, including Hoover, the same bloodhound used to search for Joshua Guimond on his campus. Both bloodhounds got hits at the same locations, in front of the pizzeria, inside a parking garage next to the pizzeria, and the scent was followed to the same parking stall, stalls 89 and 90. Apparently what seemed like bloodstains were seen at the spot and a piece of red fabric, possibly coming from the red feather, which was part of Chris's costume. The Jenkins always believed that Chris entered a vehicle, either willingly or forcefully, and was driven somewhere. The searches for Chris go on for months, and tragically, on February 27, 2003, Chris's body is spotted by a lady who calls 911. The body is found in the Mississippi River, stuck between some logs, between 3rd Avenue Bridge and St. Anthony Falls. The first assumption is that Chris jumped or fell off the Hennepin Bridge, and his body floated to this location. The location that Chris's body was found was never treated like a crime scene. MPD quickly concluded that Chris had committed suicide, so the police never questioned people at the Lone Tree Bar, the scene of the body recovery was never treated like a crime scene, and no objects were ever seized or taken by the authorities. On the surface of it, it seems like an open and shut case. Chris disappeared, his body was found somewhat in the middle between the bar and his house. The MPD assumed that he must have jumped or accidentally fallen off the bridge. If you don't investigate any further, it might be easy to come to this conclusion. However, if you dig deeper and look at details more closely, the death becomes more bizarre and mysterious. First of all, Chris's posture was bizarre. Experts will tell you that if a person is drowning, their arms and legs flail in a mode of panic. Articles of clothing can come off, either while they're drowning or even after. The body normally sinks at first, but eventually the gases leave the lungs and the body is practically always facing down when it surfaces. However, Chris's body was found face up, his arms and hands crossed against his chest, a clump of his own hair was in the grasp of his right hand, and his costume was perfectly intact. His shirt was still tucked in, his slip-on shoes were still on his feet, his torso and upper body had ice formation, his legs were still underneath the water, one leg straight, the other one slightly bent. It was thought that the body must have been in the Mississippi River the entire time, but if so, why wasn't it seen by anyone until now? Others, like Chuck Letch, believed the body hadn't been in the water for the last 4 months, and if that's the case, where was it? Chris's body ended up providing more questions than answers. The Jenkins revealed that Chris had played a lacrosse game a few days before his disappearance. As a goalie, he would have had some bruises on him. However, when he was found, there were no bruises. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of trauma, no broken bones or bruising that would have occurred if he had fallen off the bridge. One thing that I found strange is that none of the Jenkins ever saw the body live to identify it. Chris's sister Sarah was making her way to Minneapolis to identify the body, only to learn that it had already been cremated. Was this just a mishap or was it done on purpose? There were pictures of the body taken when it was found, and with the native costume it was obviously Chris. The autopsy revealed that Chris had in fact died by drowning. Chris's blood alcohol level was 0.12%. This amount isn't excessive, I would call it average drunk for a college student. A bouncer recalled Chris not being that impaired and still having all his faculties. GHB, also known as the date rape drug, was also found in Chris's system. A man had come forward revealing that a couple of months before Chris's disappearance, somebody had spiked his drink with GHB at the Lone Tree Bar. He got sick, losing consciousness, and strangers were trying to force him into a vehicle, but luckily he got help from a friend and was able to get out of the situation. So obviously some shady characters hang out at this bar. Could the same thing have happened to Chris Jenkins? However, on an episode of Breaking Homicide, it was revealed that the quantity of GHB found in Chris's system was a normal quantity produced by the body after death when decomposition occurs. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a forensic pathologist, doesn't believe Chris had an abnormal amount of GHB in his system, so he is skeptical that any was given to Chris. By 2004, the MPD closed the case, but the Jenkins held on to the belief that Chris was murdered. Retired detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte eventually threw their hats into the investigation. They had looked into the drowning of several young men along the Interstate 94 corridor in the Midwest. They initially believed that Chris's death was connected to the deaths of over 40 other young men in 11 states, mostly college students. They strongly believed in the smiley face killer theory, an organized group who was abducting and murdering young men, and oftentimes left a smiley face somewhere nearby the body of water where the victims' bodies were found. But whether you want to believe in the smiley face killer's theories or not, no smiley faces were found in the vicinity of Chris's body. I personally don't believe in the theory. I think the smiley face killer theory is an urban legend that gained traction over time. I think at most there might be pockets of people out there, wannabe killers, who might kill to uphold the legend, but otherwise I don't believe in any large coordinated organization. Although some credible people believe the group is real, so I'm nobody to dispute them. But regardless, nobody believes Chris was a victim of such a group. Something else happened here. Since it was so strongly believed that Chris jumped or was thrown off the Hennepin Bridge, Chuck Letch found camera footage of the bridge on the night that Chris disappeared. The Federal Reserve Bank, located near the Mississippi River, had at least 2 cameras overseeing the Hennepin Bridge. However, Chris was never seen walking on this bridge. There's only a few blocks between Lone Tree Bar and the Hennepin Bridge, so it's most likely that Chris was picked up or forced into a vehicle in between. Hennepin Bridge is always brightly lit and always has traffic, so it's unlikely Chris could have been thrown off that bridge or jumped on his own. It's just not private enough. Also, there is some beam beneath the bridge that extends to the outer sides. So even if someone is jumping off or thrown off, it's not a straight drop into the water. They would fall onto this platform first. The condition that Chris's body was found just doesn't support a dangerous fall from a bridge. It's too high of a fall to not have broken bones or bruising. There are also discrepancies in some of the events leading up to the disappearance. For example, initially, when employees of the bar were questioned before the gag order, many people stated they saw Chris being escorted out of the bar. The supervisor was advised, and word to security was to not let the man dressed in the Indian costume back into the bar. A man by the name of Tony Norris was a bouncer at this bar. When initially questioned by Chuck Letch, Tony seemed to suggest that Chris was not thrown out of the bar. But when two of his fellow bouncer colleagues seemed to be signaling him, he changed his story to possibly Chris was escorted out of the bar. However, in the 2018 Breaking Homicide episode, Tony Norris said that Chris in fact walked out of the bar. Apparently some beer had been spilled on him. They were joking around that he peed himself. Chris left the bar irate but half joking with Norris. Norris also states that Chris didn't seem that intoxicated. I'm a little confused as to why, if Chris left the bar on his own, why would the bar spin a narrative that he was forced out? I think that actually makes them look worse and more liable. Norris could be lying, but he seemed to be credible and honest in his statement. While Chris's death was initially listed as unknown, meaning accident or suicide, in 2005 things started to take a turn though. An incarcerated man was questioned on unrelated charges. Police received a tip that him and another man came across Chris on the Hennepin Avenue Bridge pedestrian walkway that night. The story here is that it was an attempted mugging, but since Chris didn't have his belongings on him, this angered his muggers and the accomplice flung him over the railing. But as we mentioned before, Chris wasn't seen on the cameras overlooking the bridge, no unusual activities either. Also, as mentioned before, Chris's body wouldn't have been in the position it was in with the tucked shirt and the slip-on shoes still on his feet. In November of 2006, the death was reclassified as a homicide by Tim Dolan. The police had never revealed the name of the incarcerated suspect, although he has come to be known as Jeremy Lynn Alford. Alford was in prison for the brutal murder of his landlord and roommate Douglas Miller, a crime he committed alongside his younger brother. Douglas Miller's mobile home was also set ablaze. The brothers did this because they were about to be evicted by Miller for stealing and not paying the rent. Sheesh. As we dig deeper into Alford's background, we find out that he was part of a group called the Dealers of Death. One of the members was called Smiley, which led people to confound or confuse the group for the smiley face killers. This group often went to the Lone Tree Bar and engaged in shady stuff, whether it's drug trafficking or robbing people for drug money is anybody's guess. But Alford himself might have possibly been at that bar the same evening Chris disappeared. Did Chris get into some altercation with Alford or one of his cronies, which led to his murder? Smiley stated that Alford had confessed to murdering a college student in an Indian costume. I killed this stupid looking dude and threw him off the bridge. Although Smiley revealed that the name was Andrew, so it's not 100% sure this was Chris. A female informant told that Alford had bragged about killing Jenkins. On the show Breaking Homicide, Derek Levasseur actually wrote a letter to Alford, seeing if he could fish any information out of him. Alford's response was, "I really don't want to talk about any crime that I haven't been charged with and or convicted of." Jen Jenkins jumped at this statement, believing it was nothing short of a confession. I don't know that I'm 100% convinced though. Being a loose cannon with a long rap sheet, to me this statement could simply mean, I've done a lot of crap, I don't want to talk about anything I haven't been charged with or convicted of. Also, if he did murder Jenkins, it's definitely a different murder than his roommate Douglas Miller. Miller's murder was really brutal and savage. We're talking about multiple stab wounds and such. Chris Jenkins' murder seemed to be more calculated and well executed under the short planning time, and his death still baffles family and authorities to this day. But don't get me wrong, I am not ruling it out. Alford could still have carried out both murders, even if they're very different. Alford admitted the Dealers of Death were responsible for over 40 murders, so anything is possible. The Jenkins family is pretty convinced that Alford is their son's murderer, whether directly implicated or not, but police could never come up with enough evidence tying him to the murder, and without a full confession from Alford, Chris's manner of death remains uncertain. Chris's house was 1.6 miles away from the Lone Tree Bar. It is approximately a 6-minute drive or a 32-minute walk. Chris's body was found near the 3rd Avenue Bridge on the east side. Chuck Letch conducted various experiments to test how Chris's body could have ended up at that precise location, like dropping objects from different parts of the river to see where they'd end up. He concluded that Chris's body would have had to have been dropped either east or north of the Nicolay Island to end up at the location it was at. There is another theory that Jenkins might have ended up on Nicolay Island that evening, whether to attend some party or was taken there for some reason. There seems to be dozens of possibilities as to what could have happened to Chris Jenkins that night. What do you think happened? Did Chris walk towards his place either willingly or because he was forced out of the bar and he accidentally fell off the Hennepin Bridge, or just decided to commit suicide right there and then? If so, why wasn't any footage captured on the surveillance cameras? And why did his body surface months later with his arm crossed, shirt tucked in, slip-on shoes still on? Did Chris have an altercation with some undesirables at the bar, like some members of the Dealers of Death or Jeremy Lynn Alford? He was angry and decided to go for a walk to cool off, or felt threatened and decided to just go home, and he was intercepted by these members. Let's remember Chris was possibly inside a garage parking lot too. Did Chris suffer from a gang beating in front of the Times Square's pizzeria and ultimately his murder, perhaps as some form of gang initiation, although there are no signs of a beating on Chris's body? Did Chris's girlfriend at the time have anything to do with his murder, flirtatious with a police officer, and for whatever reason wanted to cause harm to Chris? Was there a party on Nicolay Island that Chris decided to go to, or was forced into a vehicle and taken there, since evidence would seem to suggest that Chris's body went into the water from east or north of Nicolay Island? Was Chris a victim of the Smiley Face Killers, a group believed to have caused dozens of male college students to drown, although no smiley face was found nearby? There is a book entitled Footprints of Courage, released in 2009 by Jenkins, which chronicles the family's difficult struggle to search for Chris. It's pretty heartbreaking, while offering many details on the case from the Jenkins family's perspective. So, what do I think happened to Chris Jenkins? Well, keep in mind that my opinion doesn't matter, but here is the scenario that plays in my mind. I think it's possible that Jenkins had some form of altercation inside the bar. Nothing too serious, some bad dude maybe flirting with some unwilling young lady, and Chris kinda stepped in to help her out. This individual might have subtly poured beer into Chris's lap without drawing attention from anyone in the bar. Slightly irate, Chris decides to leave the bar, either to cool down or to possibly run home to get change, though he doesn't have his keys on him. If you believe that Chris was ejected from the bar, my scenario still works. The bad individual from the bar decides to follow and intercept Chris outside. These are gang members, possibly dealers of death. They may have threatened Chris with a gun or knife to get inside their vehicle in the garage parking lot, possibly attacking Chris in the process, although this is risky since bypassers could possibly see what is happening. But possible blood and a piece of Chris's feather is found near stalls 89 and 90 at the parking lot. They decide to drive around with Chris, doing whatever. They end up on Nicolay Island, to a discreet spot where they know they won't be seen. I believe there are at least two individuals, one with a gun or knife, forcing Chris to go to his knees, in front of the water facing it. The other individual grabs his head to drown him in the water, maybe with some help. I do think Chris was killed before actually being dumped in the water, the killers trying to decide what to do with the body. From here, either they purposely set up Chris's body in the position of his arm crossed across his chest. They drop him in the water, and they were lucky enough for the body to sink, and ice forms in the river so that the body doesn't rise until months later. Chuck Letch believed Chris's body might have been kept somewhere and dumped later, although Dr. Cyril Wecht stated that the state of decomposition of Chris's body is consistent with his body being in the river for months. Anyway, maybe I'm reaching here, and it's possible I'm completely wrong, but this is one scenario that plays in my mind. It doesn't answer all of the questions, but it does fit in with a lot of the evidence. I'm not completely sure that Jeremy Lynn Alford was implicated in Chris's death, but I do think there's enough meat on that bone for him to remain a suspect. My heart goes out to the Jenkins family, who have raised questions and suffered for more than 2 decades over the mysterious death of their son. Hopefully, someday they will learn the truth. Just as with the Guimond family, the truth could allow them some form of healing.